So we're a couple of minutes after the hour. Let me go ahead and share screen and start getting into this a little bit. So what we're talking about today, the title of the talk is What UX Professionals Actually Do. This is a question that I hear a lot. It's a question that I think people in the UX field hear a lot. And I expect many of you who are here are in that position where you're a little new to the UX field and kind of curious. You hear and see different things. Indeed, the kind of brand of what UX is gets a little bit shifted here and there. It gets a little bit muddled here and there. And so one of the things I think is really valuable for me to do is to help you with getting a little vision of that. Quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to give a little introduction just about who I am and who HFI is, if you haven't heard of us. That'll be brief. A little about the foundations of UX, what it's built on, where we're coming from, what it's about. Again, brief. And then a lot of the bulk of what I think the point is today, right? Talking about what UX people actually do. Not just what it is, but what do the people who do this work actually do day to day? We hear that question a lot. And it's very easy to get it can be a little academic or otherwise a little unclear and not make it clear what we're talking about people actually doing. So that's a lot of the main thrust. But then there's a second thing that I think I really want to disambiguate about. Remember I was saying about kind of blending the perspective, blending things a little bit as far as the brand of UX. Well, I want to talk a little bit about what I might call adjacent disciplines or, sister professions. And you'll hear me say things like that, or sister disciplines. These other kind of adjacent areas. You might have seen this in the email promo thing we sent out, right? So there's all kinds of things that are, is that the same? Is it not the same, right? So if you're talking about human-computer interaction, is that the same? If you're talking about customer experience, is that the same? If you're talking about design thinking, is that the same? And so there's some blending between those. It's not always the clearest of lines, but I want to give you a little perspective about those things. I have a lot to say about that. And I'm going to have a little section about HFI's courses. The purpose of this is just that I know a lot of people have these questions, and I just want to clarify a little bit of which of our courses teach which of the things that I'll talk about in the What UX People Do things. It's just a question I know you're going to have. That way I can do that in a succinct, clear, and fast kind of way. By the way, we're going to have all of this recorded and online, so if you're wondering about it, if we have the slides or whatever, you'll see them in that recording. They'll all be there. And this section on the courses, there's like a table in there. The reason I mentioned that here, there's a table in there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not here to like sell you HFI's courses. But I know that's a question you'll have. And then I'll open it up to Q&A. And I expect that we'll have enough questions that I'll stick around a little bit past the hour if anyone's kind of wondering about scheduling, for those who want to stick around for it. But I'm going to hit the questions in a prioritized kind of way. Based on the upvotes. And so hopefully if you only have the hour, you'll still get to hear some of the most burning questions in there. So that's overall what we're doing in this time. So quick, just a few introductory words. So Human Factors International, the company I work for, is a UX company. We have been in UX under its many names. So the term UX is newer, but we've been in this world of user experience stuff and really only doing that since 1981. We're one of the longest standing companies in this. We have a deep, rich kind of a background in this space. The stuff that we do, and this is an analogy, I hope I'm not offending anyone by showing dead animals, but my apologies if I am, but I think this point is important. You've heard that idea, you can teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime, right? That whole thing. This is along those lines. The work that we actually do, there is work that is actually like doing the fishing for you and serving you a fish, right? We do UX kinds of consulting work. There's a variety of that kind of work. We do that everything from little minutia kinds of stuff up to bigger strategic kinds of things. There's a whole variety of that consulting kind of work we do. There's also a piece of what we do that is training. And I'll acknowledge, by the way, that training is one of the things we're most known for, especially within the UX field, among UX practitioners. And the reason for that is really that, any hour that I spend teaching, and that's one of the things I do, but any hour that I spend teaching is going to expose me to a room of usually, 20 or so, 20, 25 different UX people who then can go off and get an impression of me as a teacher. And so it's easy to miss that we do other kinds of work too, even though it's actually a lot of our work. The third thing that we really focus on at HFI is UX maturity. So it's like taking this thing even further, right? So not only will we teach you to fish, we will help, if you think about it, right? Most fish you eat today is not procured by standing there with a fishing rod. It's a giant fishing operation, and that has a very different way that it's done. It's not to say it has nothing in common, but the way that that's done at an industrial scale is different. In that same way, one of the things that HFI has really pioneered and focused on is, well, how do you do UX work at an industrial scale? And so that's part of the world of stuff that we focus on, that we help with and care about. So that's just a little bit about who we are, what we do, and you can learn more about us on our website. But I just want to give you a little context, so in some ways, what my biases are as I talk today, right? Oh, and by the way, I'm seeing it on my screen. If you see the video kind of hovering over my face over here, otherwise you can move that video. There may be like a split screen thing you can do. I don't want to go through kind of teaching all of that for just an hour thing, but if there's something that I'm covering, you can just move that by clicking and dragging it. A little bit about me. Before joining HFI, I got my doctorate in UX and digital games. I studied and researched UX and digital games, and I'm kind of a game geek. That's a little bit about my stuff, but I've been with HFI for 10 years, in which time I've done basically no game stuff. So I have much less to say about that now. My official title is User Experience Strategist, and the work that I actually do is combined between consulting and instructing, a mix of those things over the years. And the consulting involves a variety of things. My specializations tend to be actually stuff that's a little bit more sophisticated. So if today you're joining me and you're someone who's been in the field for a long time, this may feel a little bit rudimentary because we're speaking at this kind of basic level. But if you are newer to the field, then this should be more comfortable. But it's worth saying that some of this kind of stuff, and if you have questions about this stuff, sometimes I can answer it. This stuff about especially UX maturity of organizations, right? The thing I was talking about an industrial scale fishing operation. And also because of my background in UX and games, the emotional and persuasive design kind of world. I'll talk a little about that today. I've also included, just for color, a little other stuff here, stuff I do. So before the pandemic, I was a performer as kind of a fun side hustle thing. I live in New York City. I live in Brooklyn. And so this is me in Coney Island performing there. There was a show in Times Square that I would perform at pretty regularly. I'm a magician. And so that's one of my kind of side hustle things. I also care about physical fitness stuff and try to lift heavy things to stay fit. And here I am, much better than I am now in the pandemic. But so these are things that I used to do and can't do anymore. Now instead, I spend that time helping to take care of our 2-year-old, who is adorable and reckless and very happy, but very accident prone. So that's a little more of my other stuff. All right, so enough about me. Let's talk about what we're here for. Yeah. First of all, a little about the foundations, right? At a basic level, I hope you have the question a little bit, right? Oh, I've met people who do this work who seem to have a background in one thing and another. What's going on here, right? What is UX about? What is it based in? And the answer to that is really, and you might hear some people who are from more of a kind of a graphic design background, some people who are from maybe a background that's more about development. Maybe you meet other people who are from a background of, some people who do interior decoration, right? There's a whole variety of backgrounds that people can come into the field from. But what is the field really based in? And I think this is critical, right? That's what I want to answer. So first of all, let's just acknowledge, right, there's some bottom line kind of things that we're trying to address. Kind of everyone who's doing design development stuff will care about these things. These are, the various kinds of costs and values to a company. So conversion and retention kinds of stuff is very normal. And, there's lots of other folks who do this too, right? So conversion retention is something marketing or CX or everyone cares about that, right? If I can do other things like reducing training costs and having fewer skills of the user, right? These are all bottom line things I'm trying to target. So that's important that we all understand. Also worth understanding kind of how I do that. And this is one level removed from that, right? In UX, what we're at a bottom line way, what we're trying to do is help to make, and this is the left side of this, right? Make interfaces more learnable, more memorable, easier to use in this kind of way that's about it being efficient, and also more effective, and also more satisfying. Right? These kinds of things. And the ways that we do that are some of these kinds of things on the right? We do a bunch of things to prevent errors and make things intuitive and all of this. And the exact details of these, some cases we do more or less of some of these different things. It's not always all of these things full to 100%, but importantly, we understand what we're targeting. And so then how do I do that in UX? Well, we're going to talk about the activities, but at its heart, what I want to start with, right, this foundations thing, UX is a field that is based in psychology, right? The science of understanding human perception, human interaction, the way that humans work. And that is not a thing that is, that is not a thing that is, I have ideas about how things should be, and they're going to be pretty, and your idea versus my idea. That is something that is about science. Now, it's not purely science. It's a science and an art, and there is some of that kind of stuff involved. But I just want to really emphasize that this is founded in, it's based in psychology and really a practical application of psychology. And specifically, I'd say, Gestalt psychology, cognitive psychology, stuff like that. I saw someone raised a hand. You may not have seen it before, and let's see, we have a few more participants now and all of that. If you have questions, then right now I'm saving them to the end because they're likely to get answered a little later, but feel free to put them into the Q&A box and upvote questions if you see them that you like. By the way, a little side note about this, right? These kind of categories of human psychology stuff on this screen, I want to highlight. This stuff, visual, intellect, memory, motor, is kind of traditional usability stuff, which is a component of UX. It's about how I understand how you kind of interact with, perceive things, operate things, right? It's that set of things. This other set of stuff on the right, you might notice this is a different flavor, right? Unconscious learning and motivation, arousal, emotion are things that are involved in decision making. When we start talking about emotional design, start talking about persuasive design, there's this kind of separate set of things. Now, at Human Factors International, we have coined this term PET, P-E-T, and you'll hear, I'm going to allude to that briefly here and there throughout. So there's kind of a division as far as the work between traditional usability and persuasion, emotion, and trust, PET. So I'll try to keep that to a minimum. I tend to try to say persuasive design or emotional design when I'm talking about that stuff. But if you hear me say PET, that's what I'm talking about. And it's a different kind of level of processing that happens for humans. In both cases, though, there's a whole boatload of psychological research done that helps us to understand that, anticipate it. And again, this is a science. This is the foundation of it. This is not to negate or ignore the art aspect. That is part of the world of UX. There is a side of things that is not everything that has a research study that's been done on it. And there's some stuff that is not really about the science of it. There's some stuff that is about people's tastes and is subjective. And we still want to do user research, but we'll often have to do user research on those specific designs, right? So even in those cases, we're going to apply scientific techniques. Okay. Again, not to say that you can't come into this field from other disciplines and other areas, but if you do, you need to come up to speed on some of this kind of stuff. Let me also emphasize, right, and I'll also acknowledge that this is a little bit of a, not everyone in the field would agree with HFI's perspective, but certainly HFI's perspective and my perspective is that working in the UX field is not a anyone can walk in and do it thing. It is a thing that requires serious expertise. It is a thing you can get wrong and can train wreck. If you have a bunch of great expertise in a sister discipline, we'll talk about those later, that does not mean that you can walk in and this all is intuitive and straightforward and I just kind of think about it and it's fine and throw stuff on a screen. That is not the world of this stuff. So when you see something like you're going to do great UX without time, money, or design skills, you're being lied to. That's not UX, right? I'll acknowledge, right? UX is a field with many voices. It's a little unclear sometimes how much credibility someone has and all of that. And I have my own biases. Not everyone agrees with me and they're wrong. It's a little joke, but there is a little bit of a thing there of you'll hear other voices and that's actually kind of okay. But I do feel pretty strongly about these things myself. You'll see things like this about, oops, I had a little thing circled there. How do I land a career with 0 qualifications? Maybe start by getting some qualifications, right? And obvious bias here as working at a company that provides training, but we care about the field, bottom line. And if you get hired at a company that is wanting to start doing UX for the first time, and you fool them into yeah, oh yeah, I know UX, you're actually some other thing, right? You actually do visual design or development or some other thing, and you fool them into that, what will tend to happen is they're expecting you to do stuff that is at least, vaguely UX work. They may not fully understand what that is. You don't really know how to do that. And what tends to happen is it train wrecks, and that's bad for everyone in the field. So it's not just, yeah, I'm from a training company. It's also that I care about the field, right? That is bottom line why we make a lot of the decisions we make at HFI. But yeah, biases and knowledge, right? All right, so let's talk about what UX people actually do. And I think this is where there's a lot of confusion for folks sometimes, and I'll try to make that clear. I really like this diagram to make it clear for people who are not familiar with the field. This is something we created to really explain this, and I'm going to use this as a framework for this whole kind of section of the talk today. So there's different stuff we do depending on what kind of phase you're in. And this is loosely done in a way that is from top to bottom, earlier to later, from the perspective of how early or late it is in terms of the projects you do, right? So the stuff that's the bottom half of this is individual projects. The discovery or epic phase is where you're really selecting, you're either selecting what projects you're doing or often kind of putting together the framework in certain ways, right? That architecture of the project before you get into the details of it. There's also a level that we're calling here enterprise level, and that is both what we call the omnichannel strategy, which is out in front of even what projects I'm doing. It's this kind of identity of who we are and how our stuff fits together and stuff like that. It's this very big overarching kind of stuff. And then there's this capabilities level, which is really a constant thing that we're doing of improving our capabilities to do UX work. Now, I'm going to go through these one at a time. So if that overview felt a little brief and vague, that's why I'm going to go into each of these. But I want to get you a little oriented to those timeline kind of phases. I'll also mention just at the outset, I find it's very common for people who are not familiar with the field to want to pigeonhole UX into one of these things, or maybe two of them. And usually it's one or two of those things that's towards the bottom of this, that happens much later in the process. And that is kind of bad for everyone involved. So a little walkthrough of all of these different things. Oh, and one other quick thing for context, right? At this high level thing, not only is this happening in sequence, to involve UX up higher in this earlier on is less common, and it's less common because those things require more trust in UX. And the result of that, though, is that if you do that, then you have these things driven by user centricity, right? Driven by an understanding of users, which is tremendously valuable. So yes, it takes a little bit more investment, a little more time earlier on, but the outcome of that is you provide more and more value the higher in that kind of food chain that you can move. It's important to give you all that context, I think. So let me paint the picture of what each of these things is. We're going to start off with these bottom kind of four things. The maintenance thing is really these other three things going on in a continuous way. So I'll walk through each of these, right? We'll start off with review. Expert review is at its core, I am going through screen by screen or going through the design, and I'm doing an evaluation as an expert. Now, this comes with the downside that I may not be I certainly am not the user. There are a lot of ways that I am by necessity not going to be like the user, and that's normal. So the validity of this is a little bit threatened because of that, right? It's a little bit uncertain about how sure I am of this evaluation. The more that I've done research with this type of user, the more accurate I can be. And there are lots of these types of these expert evaluations. Heuristic evaluations are evaluations through a set of shortcuts, a set of basically reminders of things I should evaluate for. There's kind of a basic expert evaluation that's not driven by heuristics. We can do walkthroughs where I go through often by persona and say, all right, so this persona, I know these things about this kind of user, right? This representative kind of user type. And here is what I think they'll anticipate. Here's what I think will happen based on those different user personas. There's a variety of these kinds of evaluation techniques. And the basic thing this is doing is finding mostly detailed design kinds of problems. It's giving you that kind of feedback. These are the layers of design. We teach these and get into them in depth in the design class, right? Not everyone would necessarily agree with this particular breakdown, but I find it to be quite good. Navigation, we often say presentation, but the layout of the screen, the content on the screen is in the text and all of that, interaction. So we're going to do this kind of an evaluation. Okay, anything else? The upside of this that I want to highlight is that it's fast and cheap, right? I can sit and do this kind of evaluation in, depending on the size and scale of the thing, somewhere between, a day or a few days, or sometimes if it's much bigger than a week or two, but I can do this much faster and cheaper than doing something like a usability test, which we'll talk about next. But the downside is that it's very easy to argue with. And if I don't know much about the users, then it's probably good to argue with it because I'm not so sure it's right. So that's an expert review. A usability test, this is one of the most kind of well-known, tried and true things in the UX field, been around for a very long time. At its heart, what I'm doing is sitting with the user and they try to do certain tasks and they think aloud while they do it. I, as a moderator, am going to kind of prompt them to explain what they're doing and think out loud. And we're going to see how that goes. I'm going to see where they get stuck and have problems, right? This is vastly better than asking people to self-report about things. People are very bad at self-reporting. Actually getting to see how that goes is much better. So a bunch of upsides of this in that kind of way. It takes some time and work to set that up and get participants and all that stuff, but very valuable along these lines. It is, however, a little bit limited. I want to emphasize in particular this second point I made here, right? When you are doing a usability test, you might see a person struggling and having trouble. One of the most common things you'll see, we find that about 80% of usability problems are a problem of navigation, right? So you guess about 80% of the problems you find with the usability test are problems of navigation as well. So if that happens, if you're having a problem with navigation, then what do I know how to fix it, right? I know that there's a problem and I might make a guess about how to fix it, but it's usually not very certain until I do other kinds of research to figure that out. I'm going to need to do some of that architecture work that I'll talk about shortly for that. But I want to highlight that, right? Usability tests are valuable and they're a little more certain than that expert evaluation, but they don't necessarily tell me what to do. And this is another of these things. Don't pigeonhole UX or usability or whatever you're calling it. Don't pigeonhole it into just usability testing. We do so much more. Detailed design is another component of the work we do. Another thing I see a lot of kind of pigeonholing around, right? People think of, especially if they meet people who call themselves things like UX designers or UI UX designers. Often those people are not really UX professionals, right? And there's a larger conversation perhaps to be had about designers versus UX designers versus UX researchers, and if you should have a division between those, it's its own conversation. But the point with this is to say UX is not just detailed design, and I think it's especially deadly if you get pigeonholed into that in the field. If you never have any user research going on, you're not really doing UX, right? Whether you're the one conducting the research or not, you've got to be having some contact with real users to find out what's really going on. Otherwise, painting screens is not UX. That's a tiny piece of what we do that only actually is UX if it fits into the larger picture of things. And I'll emphasize, right, this navigation structure, that's the architecture thing we're going to talk about shortly. If you don't have that in place, then this is very, very, let's say, under leveraged. You can help to improve the look and feel of things a little bit. You can improve how understandable things are a bit and think how things are laid out on a screen a little bit, but you really need that navigation structure. Otherwise, this is going to be, the wrong side of the Pareto principle, right? The 80-20 rule. All right, so that's a little bit about that kind of bottom level. This next level up is this kind of discovery or epic phase. I want to emphasize these are things that need to happen if you're in the agile world, right? I'm speaking in the agile kind of language for those of you who are familiar with that stuff. This is before you get into sprint cycles, right? This is at that phase before I start doing the detailed design level work. I'm going to do this kind of work because I need to have this in place to drive a lot of that. And for this other stuff, things like detailed design, fill in a bunch of pages, create a bunch of pages, well, I need to have that fit into the architecture that's built out ahead of time. And if I don't have that, we are, let's say, very weak. I emphasize that because this architecture step I see as, in practice, probably the place the most companies fall down in terms of UX. And so what is that architecture phase? Well, I mean, it's a little bit deep and complex, but at a high level, it's about the navigation and about structuring the navigation in a way that makes sense to your users. And that's surprisingly hard, right? Let me give you, this slide talks about this deep mental model, a few words about what that means, right? The deep mental model, think of it this way, right? If you walk into a physical shoe store back when those were open, you look around and you expect it to be organized a certain way. You expect to see men's shoes separate from women's shoes, separate from kids' shoes. I expect for men's shoes that I will go over to the men's shoes and they're going to be separated by athletic shoes, which are separate from dress shoes and often separate from sandals, right? That kind of thing. Maybe I want dress shoes, so I walk over to the dress shoes and I see those divided perhaps by brand. Well, in that same way, if I come to Zappos, right, I want that site to be organized the same way, to be organized by first by men, women, and kids, and then next under men's by the type of shoe, right? Dress shoes and athletic, same organization, because that's a mental model that the users tend to have. Now that may seem very obvious, right? And by the way, this is closely tied with information architecture, but there's also a component of this that's about how it's designed on the screen. That's the difference between this and just information architecture. But I want to emphasize, right, the Zappos example I was giving. Let's say I worked at Zappos and my job was to deal with inventory of shoes. So if I'm thinking about shoes, is my mental model men's, women's, kids, all of that? Probably not, right? I'm probably receiving shoes from different shoe manufacturers. So I probably divide them up by the different manufacturers. What if you showed up at Zappos and the first thing you had to do was say the manufacturer? And I'm not even sure if manufacturer is the same as brand. I don't work in that space, but if it was Nike and then Adidas and then you picked which gender it was, or you picked Nike, Adidas, and then it was by item number or something, right? It would be totally unusable. And it is shockingly easy when you work for any given company to change your mental model to no longer be like your users. And that's an example. The shoe store example is one that we kind of all have and is fairly intuitive. Most of your different mental models out there are not so intuitive. And I'll go a step further and say that it's different depending on who you are as a company, right? Go to the navigation for how you select what you're going to watch when you're at Netflix. Go to the same thing for HBO Go. They are nothing alike, even though they're both, I'm watching kind of long videos. Why is that happening? It's totally different users, somewhat different contexts, right? And so it changes how you're going to organize that. So this is important and hard. I haven't been talking much about persuasion, emotion, and trust along the way. And so all of these things have kind of a persuasion, emotion, and trust component. This is the method we use for coming up with what we call, this is taught in the PET architecture class. It's got what we call the PET architecture process. Remember, PET is persuasion, emotion, and trust, right? We're talking about persuasive design, emotional design. And this is basically a strategy for coming up with a strategy for persuasive design. Because you need to have a strategy. It's not, yes, you can throw a few persuasive tools here and there. I make something look scarce and I make it look high prestige. And I mean, these are some things that are intuitive. There are many that are less intuitive. But if I'm really going to be effective, I need a strategy all throughout. And so we do that in a way that begins with research. And then we analyze that research, we focus in on that research and select which areas we're focusing on. We do a set of things to come up with kind of ways that we target that. And then we're able to select which persuasion tool we're using. We're even able to think about how we do that through the flow of the user's experience step by step. So that's what we call the PET architecture process. And again, this is the architecture level when you're talking about persuasion, emotion, and trust. I didn't do it before. I got a little off track. I should acknowledge, by the way, the things I talked about earlier, right? And forgive me for flipping through slides a touch. But so, expert reviews, I can do that for persuasion, right? What persuasion strategies are you using? What tools are you using? Usability testing, we can do user research in a similar way to see how effective something is that's trying to persuade you. Detailed design, similarly, I can do design, screen-by-screen design focused on persuasion. So those are things that can be done separately or together in all cases, right? Except for the research. But they can all be done, aside from research, can all be done together, where I do detailed design for both usability and persuasion. Sorry for getting a little out of sequence there, guys. Cool. So that's a bit about pet architecture. And so we've talked about usability architecture, persuasion architecture, right? Then there's this other thing of innovation. This is this other thing that happens before I get into project work. At its heart, you can look at innovation. We think of innovation mostly when you hear that word as disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation is important, but it's not always disruptive innovation. Sometimes we do more incremental, smaller innovation. And in all cases, we're really saying, what am I creating? What am I making, right? Even if it's something that's very mundane. And so the point of this is to say, at your company, right, if you work in design development now, how do you decide what you're working on? At a shocking number of companies, the decision is made by executive decree, right? Someone who's an executive says, I think we need an app on the iPhone. Why? Right? And that might be a good thing, but it might not. And so instead, if we are able to think about, so if instead we're able to think about, what do users actually care about and need? What are their pain points? What are their emotional needs? And have that drive innovation. It is much more powerful. This is an incredibly high value thing to do. So that's a little bit about innovation. And if you work in the UX field, I think this is less targeted for those people, but I'll tell you, people who work in the UX field, I hear them all day long say, I am constantly trying to make a new design perfectly usable. And in the back of my mind, I know, because I know a bunch of stuff about these users, as usable as I make it, no one wants it. It's a painful position to be in. So that's why innovation is so important. All right, so this diagram should be making more and more sense, and we're moving up this value chain ladder. You probably are starting to see why it gets more valuable as we go higher up the ladder. And I'll wrap up with these last two things, right? Omnichannel strategy and capabilities. This is wrapping up this section, then we'll talk about other sister disciplines and get to Q&A and all that too. All right, so cross-channel strategy, a couple of components of this. At its heart, the biggest thing is a company will tend to have lots of different kind of channels, modalities, ways they interact. This is not universal. This is from one particular engagement, so I don't want to give you the wrong impression about this. But different channels are going to have different things that people expect to do on them. Simple, easy example of that, right? We do lots of work among other industries in the financial sector, and if you're going to your bank, your kind of normal retail bank, do you want that bank to offer you to apply for a mortgage on your mobile phone, where you have to fill in a million different complex fields and type all this stuff out and all of that? Probably not, right? It's hard to do data entry on a phone. It's just a simple, obvious kind of an example. So there's stuff like that. There's other stuff about how people expect things to be. And there's other stuff about, where do I go for which thing? By the way, at its heart, I hear a lot of high praise for Apple, and the people tend to talk about Apple as being successful because of its design, in terms of it like being pretty. And I'm not here to argue about that aspect in particular, but I think there's a real argument to be made that the reason that Apple is so successful in their space isn't because they make pretty stuff. Compare them, or because they make powerful stuff, or any of that either, right? Compare them to something like Sony. Right, Sony makes some of the nicest, highest, most powerful kinds of gadgets, and they often are very beautiful. What's different between Sony and Apple? One of the biggest things is actually really the cross-channel strategy and the success of that. Right, what Apple successfully did was they have all of their separate things, and they all fit together in a way. Right, the devices kind of all fit together around iTunes. If you go into an Apple store versus going to the online channel, they all have the same kind of information architecture in that, the way that the stuff they offer is laid out. In a way, if you're looking at how to be really successful in a space, a lot of the time, the best way to do that is with this kind of thing, this kind of cross-channel strategy thing. It is blindingly hard to do a lot of the time, because you have to understand what the strengths are of the company and how that fits in, and have a persuasive thing that fits into that, and understand all the channels. It's not just about the channels either, right? It's also a persuasion thing that's built into that. What's the persuasive strategy of us as a company? Apple does a thing. They do a few different things, and they vary it a little bit depending on what the case is, but they do a thing that is, one of the things they do is about, if you don't feel very confident about technology, they say, you know, it's not that you're bad with technology, it's that you haven't had our more modern good things, and you can be very modern and up to date and up to speed, and feel better about that feeling you've had in the past about being bad with technology. Right? They do things like that. They do things that are, look, our devices all look kind of similar to each other, so you can be like everyone else. And for people who have a need to blend in, there's that thing going on, right? There's other stuff about you're going to be kind of unique. And those things are a strategy that's done so they fit together. This is not a thing that is a bunch of separate things splitting off into different directions. It all fits together. Here's an example where we did this. We were working for a company, and we looked at, they had all these different channels, all these different ways you could interact with the company. And we said, well, okay, but you know, where do I go if I want to do one thing? What if I want to buy I want to buy more minutes if I'm prepaid, or I want to download a ringtone or something, and you know, whatever the thing is, where do I go for that? And it was very confusing because they had all these different channels. So what we did was we redesigned it, but with that redesign, we also had other channels, and we had something that was behind that. It's not just, yeah, it's responsive, right? There was a question before about responsive design. This is one of the answers to that. Right? And you'll hear, by the way, a discussion about, well, most companies tend to already have a website and they try to scale it down. And so there's a reaction to that of saying, no, we should do mobile first, start with the mobile and then scale it up. And the answer is those are both wrong. The answer is you're much better off starting with a strategy that says, what are all of the different channels? And by the way, right, this is what we're showing here. There's also these channels of their phone numbers you call into in call centers. They have retail locations, all these different things that all fit in. So how do you have all that fit together? And then you can look at all those separate things. And then I can decide, am I doing responsive design or adaptive design? And how am I thinking about it? What's different? Do I take out some features or hide some features? And all those kinds of decisions can fit after that strategy based on those decisions. UX capabilities is the last of these things I'm talking about that we do, right, in the fields today. This is my favorite chart for it. It gives you an overview. If you've been in the field a while, some of these things will make sense. It's a much bigger conversation and incredibly valuable and important. I'll say our company's founder, Eric Schaefer, wrote the book, The Institutionalization of UX. If you care about this thing of building the capabilities of a company, I would suggest checking that book out. It's not like it's not as expensive as our courses, but we do have a course on this as well. I'll talk about those in a minute. But the overview of this, right? There's a bunch of stuff in terms of capabilities, in terms of the staffing, right? Having enough staff is very intuitive for many people, but it's not just having enough staff. They need to be well trained. They need to be able to work together. They need to be fitting into an org structure that works. They need to have executive kind of guidance from usually the C-suite. Not to say that person shows up every day, but they need to have a connection up through management where that executive C-suite person cares about what they do, right? That's the executive champion thing here. You can see as I'm building that executive championship is first and foremost. A written strategy is not a mission statement, right? I need to have a plan for how I build capabilities. That's what this is, a detailed plan with a roadmap. There's also a bunch of stuff we talk about as infrastructure, and we don't mean like server farms. We mean like it's knowledge, like intellectual property kinds of infrastructure, UX knowledge. So the methodologies I follow as I do my work, my design standards, we're talking about templates, right? Where I keep all my UX information and a place to do user research, usability tests, and otherwise, ongoing metrics I use, right? So there's a whole set of different things we do. And once we get things firing on all cylinders, we are way more powerful. This is something I care deeply about, but I have to restrain myself from taking too much time on. That's all I'll say for now. But that's a big deal. So now you have kind of an overall view. These are all the different things we do in UX, right? That's what we mean when we say UX. I hope if you before had UX locked into a box, we are now hopefully moved from outside of that. I understand that there's some dissonance in that. Many of you we'll get to the Q&A. Some of you will be going, isn't that marketing's job that thing? Or isn't that, right, that kind of thing happens? So maybe we'll see in the Q&A. But this is the world of stuff that we do in the world of UX. Worth saying that as I start in UX, I'm usually starting lower down here. As I spend more time in the field, I'm able to grow into the higher value things. And it's valuable to have that backing. It's valuable as you start getting into architecture, innovation, and all this other stuff, to have that experience in that more kind of nitty gritty stuff as well. Not to say there's a disagreement, right? I've talked to other people who say you need to start with these things. I'm not so sure, but I think it is valuable. A couple of quick other things about this area. I know many of you are thinking about a career in it. You might hear the term T-shaped skills. And what that refers to is it is good if you are, and this is especially popular in the world of Agile, by the way, the Agile development stuff, which almost every company does right now. Not literally every company, but it's very common. And it has many variants. But this T-shaped skills idea is the idea that you should have deep knowledge in one area, but at least be kind of able to speak the language of other areas. And there's some, arguments to be had about should you try to be a jack of all trades and really like do everything. I'm not going to call myself user experience. I'm going to be a webmaster or something like that versus being a little more specialized. At HFI, we believe in being pretty specialized in UX. We believe in we believe in, you need some amount of this kind of stuff in order to be able to speak with those other people. But, bottom line, end of the day, I don't have a background in programming, right? I should be able to speak that language a little bit, not like the coding language, but be able to talk about what they're doing at a basic level so that we can communicate. But you don't want me coding stuff anyway. You don't really want me spending a lot of time in that space. And if you're coming from that background, that's great. It means you'll be able to talk that language and all of that. You deepen your experience here, and that's not a problem. But it is to say that, what's the picture of how this works? You want to be able to kind of understand the priorities of other folks and talk their language and interact with them. So I think that's worth noting. In that same way, though, I want to emphasize, just the same way you wouldn't want me to do programming, I wouldn't want you, if you don't have a background in user experience, to try to like run usability tests or do any of the UX world stuff, right? It's a different thing. All right, cool. Let's talk about adjacent disciplines a little bit. I'm going to try to keep this brief because I'm going a little behind on time. There's a bunch of synonyms for UX. So let me start with that, right? When I first kind of got into UX, it really wasn't called UX, it was called usability. And I'm relatively young in the field, right? The field's been around since like World War II. Over the years, it's been called things like engineering psychology. There was a time it was called human factors, which is why our company is called Human Factors International, because our company was born about then, right? And so it's been under all these different terms. Not every one of these is exactly the same. So ergonomics focuses a little bit more on like physical things in the world, anthropometry stuff. Usability doesn't have as much of the persuasive design kind of stuff, right? Information architecture is pretty limited to that navigation side of things, right? So it's kind of a limited snippet of this stuff, but these are all things that are pretty close synonyms. The closest synonyms, I would say, are usability, and you'll hear human-computer interaction is often used in academia. And yeah, so a user-centered design is kind of a broad bucket kind of a thing that is very synonymous with user experience. I think those are the most common you hear that are really pretty close synonyms. And there are a ton of variations when you look at job titles and all that too. Although I'm always a little leery when I see the word designer in a job title, because that tends to mean they're not really doing UX. Not always, but they're often really a visual designer. So the first thing to note for a sister discipline is visual design is not the same as UX. UI is not the same as UX. The UI is often kind of a piece of how we express the work that we've done behind things. And this is maybe an uncharitable way of looking at visual design. I think visual design is really important. And honestly, T-shaped skills thing I said before, you wouldn't want me doing visual design anyway. It's not my skill, right? This PowerPoint presentation is about the extent of how pretty I can make things, and it's not great. And that's borrowing a bunch of other people's visual design. This thing, by the way, I've got some links. I'll share this link at the end for where this is from. This is not mine. But it's a little bit harsh. It's one way to look at the difference. This is from another article. Again, I'll share the link. This is from, this is a little bit more charitable, and it's to say, there is some overlap, but you can see some of the kinds of stuff, right? When you're looking at UI design, when you're looking at design, that's a world of stuff. And this is not my area, so I'm not going to do a great job of explaining that area. But it is more about art. It is more about the kind of look and feel of things and beautification of things, often sometimes at the cost of usability, sometimes at the cost of other kinds of things. And I think it's really important that a team has someone who's dedicated to that, and that person works with someone who's doing UX, but they're not the same. You will see some people who have a background in both, but unless they have a strong background in both, they're not going to be doing the same thing. And really, any given thing that they're working on, they're probably doing one or the other thing. They're probably not doing both simultaneously. So I want to make that distinction clear. And you see some of the stuff, and I'm not going through it so much, but you see the point is there's kind of a psychology thing that's the underpinnings of this, and it has a bunch of real practical applications for the bottom line, you know, like I said before, right? Efficiency, efficacy, satisfaction, learnability, memorability. That's not the world of visual design. That's the world of UX. They have different kinds of ways that they have an impact. Another place I see confusion is front-end UI development. And I see this especially in job title stuff, right? If you're a company looking for front-end UI development, unfortunately, a surprising number will write UI/UX. If you're trying to get a job and you have a background in UI development, an unfortunate number of people will write UI/UX. They are not the same thing, right? UI development is doing the coding for the front-end stuff. They are manifesting those things on the screen. That is incredibly important, incredibly valuable. It's in demand to some extent, right? It is important stuff, but it is a different thing, right? This is not the application of psychology. This is the application of computer science to manifest designs, really. Design thinking is also another cool thing. It is kind of arguably a part of UX, arguably its own thing, but I just want to bottom line say it doesn't contain all of UX. Bottom line for this, design thinking is a company named IDEO. It's a agency. They have a process for doing innovation. Remember I talked about innovation. It's one of the things we do in UX. It's a pretty user-centered kind of an approach to innovation. It's a good approach to innovation, and there's a real argument that it's kind of a UX way to do the innovation. I think it's a very respectable way to do it. HFI, the company I work for, also has a way we do innovation. I like ours better. I'm biased. I think theirs is great though, right? And they're pretty similar. But the bottom line of it is this is a process for specifically doing innovation. And if you are trying to tackle UX by doing design thinking, you're missing a ton of the work that we do. This is not a process for that whole world of stuff that I talked about. This is one of the places I see the most confusion, and this is also an opportunity, right? Customer experience is not UX, but it has an interesting relationship with UX. And one of the things that HFI is increasingly doing is moving to try to integrate. So look, you will hear customer experience people sometimes talk about the UX CX thing being a Venn diagram like this. They say CX is this huge thing, it's this giant thing, and UX is the little bitty little tiny piece. And there's kind of a way that that's kind of a little true, but I find that incredibly misleading. A better way to understand the distinction is to understand what they do and what we do. And I've just talked about what we do and what they do. And again, I'm not specifically a CX kind of a background person, so this is a little bit of an oversimplification, and I'm sure people would disagree a little, but what you tend to see in the real world is CX people focus mostly on two things, and this is the biggest of them. Net Promoter Score, which is bottom line a way of seeing how happy people are in a pretty big global way, right? The question that's used for Net Promoter Score is like, how likely would you be to recommend this to a friend? And so then I can understand how kind of good or bad the experience is at a larger kind of level, right? And so it's about measurement. This is a way of measuring how effective things are in a bottom line way. The other big thing is customer journey mapping, where I map out the steps someone goes through. And at its best, this is done through a bunch of user research with the support of UX to really understand that. And then once I've mapped that out, I am then going to use various analytics of where I'm losing people and stuff like that to see where there are problems in that journey. And then I'm going to take that place where there are problems and I'm going to follow up on that by having UX go and investigate that. In practice, though, most companies, this story of the journey map is based on a fiction and fantasy, kind of a way to kind of loosely map together the different channels and talk about them, which is very limited. And in practice, they tend to not really do follow-up research. They tend to just go in and use common sense, and that's pretty weak. Now, another way of looking at this, right, is you're comparing these two things. Customer experience, they're focused on measurement, and as a result, they look at big data a lot. You hear a lot about big data. This idea of big data and thick data, again, not mine, and I have a link to the article this is from. I'll show at the end. But this idea, so what we're going to do is take that big data and I'm going to support it using what we might call thick data. In UX, we do a lot of stuff with much smaller samples, but rather than just big data, all I can do is look at a bunch of information points. I don't see a story. I need to talk with users one at a time. I need to watch users one at a time. I need to work with users one at a time in order to get a picture of the story. And so ideally, what I really want to do is use both. And in particular, the intersection of that is I'm going to use big data to guide investigation, to understand the why of things much more with thick data. So that's another way to talk about this, another way to think about it. And when we talk about the integration of UX and CX, this is one of the ways we do that. Another way you can look at this, and I tend to think of it this way, is that CX is going to measure and UX is going to understand why the measure is where it is. And then it's going to let us move the needle through that understanding. It's another way to look at it, maybe a little less charitable to CX. But we want to integrate those things. That's the ideal thing. Okay, I am further behind on time, but I will stick around for questions past the thing. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes for this. It'll be very brief because you can come back to the recording later, right? We talked about the different activities, right? Remember these? And so what I've done is I've taken the different courses we have. And by the way, bottom line, right? The top level, bottom line stuff, we have 2 different certification programs. The CUA is the usability level thing of can you do and find things? Are things usable? Remember, the more the learnable, memorable, effective, efficient, those kinds of things. And then the CXA is a lot more of the persuasion stuff, but also cross-channel strategy and UX maturity capability stuff. This is how it maps. So what we get is this thing where, I had nothing broken there. So you get this thing of these are the different things that we learn to do in each of these classes. You'll note that this has a blank space. That's deliberate because Foundations is not learning to do one thing. Foundations is a background. Pro tip, if you're thinking of taking one of our classes, if I would tend to recommend, if you care about being able to do a thing with it right away, don't start with Foundations, start with Design. Design is the most, like, you can turn around and do stuff with this kind of a class. It's also the class that kind of, it's kind of broad in a good way. Foundations is the underlying principles, which is really valuable, but I do see some people coming in and taking one of our classes, starting with that because it's first. And I think though it's often inspiring and great, it doesn't let you turn around and go, man, I get to do good things with that right away because it's foundational. There's some stuff that has implications for design, but that's about it. And another side note about our classes, right? You might notice that we have a class called Essentials. If you're on our website, that's what this is. There's this thing called Essentials. I want to be clear, Essentials, if you scroll down and then click on the FAQ, Essentials is for people who are not UX people and not going to become UX people. It's for the non-UX people to understand. Remember Tshape Skills, right? It's for the people who are not UX people so they get a little bit of understanding of what the UX people are doing. And we normally don't teach this where anyone can just come and see it. We normally teach this to companies because that's how that fits in best. It helps them with kind of the culture at that company so that UX can be better understood and embraced throughout. All right, and that leads into certification programs. Our certifications are well regarded. Many companies use them as a criteria for hiring, stuff like that. All right, so let me say again, right? So there's a bunch of questions I see that we have. I'm going to stick around for them. Maybe not all of them. I didn't mean to stop sharing. Share again. I was trying to open the Q&A thing. There are 29 questions right now. Take a look and upvote any that you want to hear the answers to. I'm going to take a look at those in just another second. So that's the bit about who we are, the certifications and all of that. Our certification, there are other certifications emerging from other companies and other places. Ours has been around the longest, and maybe one thing I want to emphasize that I think is worth noting, our certification is not you have taken our classes, it's a test. And the test is separate from our classes. The test is on your experience, your knowledge in the field. It is not stuff that you only learn in our classes. And so it is really a separate thing. That's part of why that test is well regarded. If you already have a serious background in UX in some way, right, you might consider just taking the test. It costs money, but you can just take the test and get the certification, and more power to you, right? That is a deliberate thing we've done for that. And it's partially because it gives more credibility to the certification, and partially because we think you need recognition if you have a background in this field. It's good. And if you take the test and you fail it, then you might want to consider following up and learning a little more. So that's a bit about that, all that certification stuff. Okay, on to Q&A. I'm going to open that up. See me big again. I hope no one has to, I hope I'm not having too many people have to run. Upvote question. All right, so top question. Having a portfolio is one of the most important things to get into the UX job. So how do I create a portfolio and where do I create it? Okay, I kind of hate this question. I not hate answering it, but I hate that it's there, right? That it has to be there. So the reality is that UX is very badly understood through the lens of a portfolio, because the work we do, yeah, it's often kind of expressed in a visual design, but it's not really about that. So the most important thing in a UX portfolio, if you're really doing UX, there is a practical thing of having some pretty images in there, because a lot of the time the person who's looking at it first is not a UX person, which sucks. But there's also a thing in that portfolio that's about showing the process, right? One of the things that anyone in UX cares about deeply is, I need to know what process you followed. And I need to know, by the way, what you did and what other people did. If you did everything yourself, then I guess you can say that. That's actually not a good thing, because it doesn't tell me you can work with a team. I actually want to see what you did, what other people did, what your role was, right? I want to get that story told. And you might have to draw, kind of, there are animated ways people have done with that, where they post it online and they have a whole involved thing, but I think it's just fine to have something that just tells the story a bit. And I expect that you're probably going to do a little bit of speaking to that, narrating it once you get in the room with someone. But the main thing is to focus, I would suggest, on the process you followed, because that's what makes us do that. What makes us UX, the process we do to create those designs. And if you are in the space of hiring for UX, by the way, just stop using that as a criteria. It's a bad criteria. It is hard to hire for UX, but that's its own thing. I hope that answers that. Next question, how different is UX research and UX design? This is a really important question. So look, there is a real debate to be had, right? Should a person doing UX do both? At HFI, our belief, and I am only halfway in agreement with this, right? At HFI, our belief is that those things are both things that you should know. You should know research and design. You should have a bunch of experience in both, and you should know them both really well. They are really, the question was how different are they, but especially because of the upvotes, I want to paint this picture, right? So they are very different things. They are somewhat related, but they're very different. So our belief is that you should do both. Our belief is that, and not just you should have done both, but to some extent as you're doing the work, you should be doing both in an ongoing way, so that there's a danger, right? The reason this is happening is there's a danger. If I'm a UX researcher, then what I'm doing is I'm sitting all day with users. I'm showing them designs and seeing how they react. I'm speaking with them to understand how they think about the world. I'm doing that stuff. If I'm a designer, then I'm sitting kind of creating screens and creating the structure of things. I'm doing the kind of where things are on the screen side of things. And the deadly thing at a company is if those two never talk. And I see that sometimes, where we have a division between those, and the designers never find out what the researchers are doing, or they find it out in the most cursory way, and that's deadly. So there's a real value in having some interaction between those, at the very least, and really a value in having people do both, so they get exposure to real users. So again, our belief as a company is that you do both. There are other people who really believe differently than that. I know the Nielsen Norman Group had a video recently that was like about UX unicorns, and their idea of that was to say there are no UX unicorns and that you need to be either in design or in research. And I see a lot of companies that make that division. I would say, though, that if you're going to go in that direction, at the very least, make sure that if you're going to go in that direction, at the very least, make sure that you're having a lot of cross talk between them, right? I want to have my designers sit in on some of the research and have them have regular meetings with the researchers, because it, again, deadly if they're separated. And by the way, I want to make sure that the researchers' work is driven by what the designers need, because that's deadly too. If we just do a ton of research that's just, I want to know about users, right? That's deadly. All right, I feel pretty good about this. I hope that's clear. I don't have a super easy way to like find out if that answered the question. Maybe maybe the next one's anonymous anyway. Okay, so 6 upvotes for this next one. Here, I'll pop open the chat box just to see if anyone said anything right immediately. Not about the things I've talked about. I'll come back to those perhaps. All right, so back to the questions. Longer question. My team is responsible for enabling innovation. There's a debate as to whether I should add a UX researcher or UX designer. This is work that is focused product improvement and new product development, baking out hunches that our business leaders have. I feel that research is critical to inform the usable right thing thoughts. Okay, so you are in a position, because the process you're describing is that it's focused on product improvement and new product development, but, but it's baking, this thing that you said here about baking out hunches that our business leaders have, that part is a problem. That part means that you're not actually doing innovation, right? You're checking innovation, which is a different thing. And that sucks. I would say that unless you have a giant team of researchers, then the researcher is what I'd prioritize, because what I really want to be doing is that team ideally is focused on finding out when things are wrong. And ideally, I would love to get in a little bit of learning about users and what their needs are and stuff like that in the edges to help to at least inform the business leaders so that they have some understanding of users to drive their decisions. Business leaders tend to be very siloed out of how users actually see the world. So that is a problem when you see that happening, in short. Someone asked in their upvotes about if they can download any form of presentation. We're going to put this up on YouTube, so just come to our YouTube channel later if you want to see this later. And we may have it on other channels too, but YouTube is definitely one of the places designers have. All right, so that's answered. Where was I? Yes, so this innovation thing, yeah, so long story short, I'd say a researcher, the reason they're thinking about designers in that context where we're talking about innovation is almost certainly that they are thinking your job is to implement their ideas, which I would candidly tend to say they are thinking that you are there to implement their bad ideas. The more that they are leaning on you to get designers, the worse the prospects are, and the more that you are not really doing what you would like to be doing. So, I mean, that's hard. It's really, really hard for those business leader people to give up the control on what is being created. It is so much fun to play the game of, I think I know the future of what people need. I think I know what we need to do. And in some ways that feels like people think that's what Steve Jobs did and stuff like that, right? It's not, but they think that. So it's a super hard thing to break. And that's the position you're in. That person was anonymous, so I can't easily pull you in. If you, if you have follow-ups, then you can put in, say something in chat, and I can either answer it directly or I can pull you into the main room. But since you asked anonymously, I'm guessing you don't want any. Next person. I am a technical product manager doing a career change to UX design. May I know how those two professions are similar? When studying about UX, it looks pretty much the same job functions I did as product manager. Okay. It's an interesting question. It's something I didn't talk about, so I'm glad you asked. Product management, and you see this sometimes, you'll see job descriptions that will say things like UX product manager, and they almost always mean product manager, and that's all they really mean, right? Like as though you have thought about the user ever and product manager. Product managers, it's an interesting thing, right? So product managers are about keeping things on the rails. There's a tremendous amount that you can, I mean, in terms of managing projects, right? It's not a deep area of expertise for me either, but the expertise that you have around basically keeping things on schedule and on the rails and all of that can often be applied to UX in that you are saying, what are the UX projects that we're doing, and how do I have those steps and have that fit together? There's different ways of handling that, right? So you can become what I would think of in that direction as a kind of T-shaped skill, have a shallower knowledge of UX, but enough where you understand what UX practices you should do at which steps, which would be tremendously valuable. You need someone else to do that UX work. But that's a tremendously valuable thing to do. And frankly, that management world is often that much better respected and paid anyway. You can often have a bigger impact, but you need to have people who are UX professionals doing that work. The other direction to go is to focus on getting a deeper knowledge. And I would say they are fairly dissimilar, right? Being a product manager, project manager, you're not, as you're being that manager, it's not about like understanding psychological principles and applying them. They will often have you do some amount of, I don't know, requirements gathering kinds of stuff, which looks a little bit on the surface like what we do in UX of sitting with users. But the questions you ask, the way you ask those questions, the way you follow up on those questions, a whole variety of things are quite different. So it depends on where you want to go. But if you really want to switch careers into UX, then I would suggest that you want some training for that. I would suggest, unless you have done, and again, I don't have a deep knowledge about being a product manager, but I would suggest those are pretty dissimilar. And I would, if you want to get into this field, I would get some direct study on it. But there's a bunch of your background and knowledge that's really going to help you. That will, be a giant leg up in someone who doesn't have that experience. One of the things that's really hard is someone who has an academic experience, an academic set of knowledge and learnings in the field, but no actual experience, doesn't know how projects actually go. And that's deadly in its own way. It's often really hard to break into the industry if you're in that position. So it's good to have a background actually doing the work. All right, cool. What's up next? Gosh, we got a bunch that are all rated 4. Let me scan them as best I can. Some of these are really easy. So what's the difference between UX and HCI? They're basically the same thing. HCI, human-computer interaction, is what the field is called in academia, but they're basically the same thing. That's pretty much all I have to say to that. It's just who's saying it and when, in terms of if they're academics or not, mostly. It's an interesting question. I'll try to answer it. So how do you start a career in UX research if you don't have experience in UX, but you have experience in academic research in the field of communications and a background in digital marketing? I mean, you're looking at something that is more similar, but there are some differences. So it's an it depends kind of thing. So the digital marketing kinds of stuff, you are closer to, for instance, the persuasive design kind of stuff, right? But I still think you want to do some training. And biased that I'm at a company that provides training, but I think the answer to that thing about it, you want to get into UX research is do some training. The diagram that I showed earlier that had the different classes we have, if you specifically want to do UX research and not the other things, I mean, as much as I think getting the full certification and understanding as much as in those classes about design and all of that would be valuable, I think that you could, if you just want to get the expertise, you could go and do, oops, did I lose the question? Something reset, sorry. But yeah, so you could just focus on the classes that are on research. So, in particular, the user-centered analysis class, for instance, and the usability testing class would be a reasonable way to have that in that focused way. Depends on your position in those ways. All right, next up. How is UX going to be affected with reference to the current situations, and which segments of the industry will be affected? I spoke about this a little bit at the start. I personally am not a fan of trying to do future casting stuff, and other folks in our company are better at that and speak to that more. In particular, Paul Lahiri Siobhan is our head of all things future casting, and also our CEO Eric Schaefer is our founder, Eric Schaefer, does a certain amount of that. It's hard to predict. Bottom line, I think UX is a good space to be in compared to many other industries and spaces because it can be done remotely. Answering this. And areas of the industry which will be affected. I mean, there's some stuff that certain kinds of research are harder to do. A lot of research can be done remotely, but not all of it. If I wanted to do research for games or toys for children, since I have a 2-year-old, it's kind of on my mind, right? That's going to be pretty hard to do remotely, but even there, I can have a parent hold a webcam on the kid, and we can do some of that kind of thing. So I don't have a lot more to say about that. I mean, you can try to extrapolate from what industries get really killed, right? Obviously, I don't want to be in the restaurant industry right now, but I don't think I have a lot of really useful stuff to say about that. Is there a way to fight product owners to have an internally done UX instead of going to a third party? Oh, that's an interesting question. That's fun. So, I work as a third party, and so I'm used to seeing that to some extent from another perspective. From my perspective, I think there's been a shift in many companies towards doing UX internally. I think that's in a way a good thing for many companies. I mean, I think it's great to work with vendors, but I think the place for vendors tends to be when you need specialized expertise or when you need a surge of particular kind of UX work that may not be an ongoing surge. It tends to be cheaper to do UX work internally. The product owner is probably thinking, I have something that is special in some way, so I want to bring in this. I want to bring in this thing, or it's also sometimes an indication that they don't trust you. So there's some stuff like that. They don't trust UX, I mean to say. Is there anything else to say to be done about that? I mean, so I guess the other big thing I would say in general about that question, right, so from Vivek Soni, is when you're talking about the internal UX stuff, part of that will help with that in general is building the capabilities of the company, right? And capabilities isn't just the personnel. It's this whole variety of things that I referenced briefly before. The more that you build that, the more that this becomes a non-question, right? You have a methodology you're following and all of that. Great question. Is accessibility a must in UX design? Accessibility is a must in general. It's legally a must if you, and here accessibility, if you're not familiar, right, it's designing for people with disabilities, so it's hard. And it's an incredibly important space. Depending on what part of the world you're in, it will affect this a little bit because there are different laws in different places. Canada is much, much more aggressive about their laws than the US, although the US is pretty aggressive too. Accessibility, again, really important, really valuable. I see it as being kind of a sister discipline to UX as well. I see it as being kind of separate. Canadians tend to see it as being the same as UX. And pretty much every Canadian person I've talked to in UX also is a serious expert in accessibility. Is it a must? I mean, legally, it's a must if you offer stuff. Basically, if you offer stuff publicly that you can't get otherwise on some online channel, then yes, it's legally a must. I think it's generally best practice for a whole variety of good reasons. For all cases, pretty much, unless you're designing for like one person, they don't have those needs, right? But yeah, by and large, it's a really important thing. But I also, in my world, I see that as being kind of a specialty that some people go into and not all people. And I see that as being kind of okay, but you should have someone who is a specialist in accessibility in most all teams and companies. Really important area, yeah. And by the way, it's of the many specializations as you do UX work, it's a good one to focus on. Getting on to less of votes. I see a few things on chat, so if anyone has stuff on chat that is burning, I suggest you put it in the question box. We still have 42 questions. I can't promise I'm going to get to all of them, but I'll stick around for a while and do my best. Let's see. So, but if you vote now, the vote matters much more because there's only 2 votes for the remaining ones so far. All right. Does the current trend of AI/ML have any influence or impact on UX? I don't think I know what ML is. Someone type that in chat. I feel like I should know what that is. Machine learning. Thank you. So there is a trend you're seeing in some places where they try to achieve UX stuff with AI, and it's by itself, it doesn't work very well in my view, because you get this thing of very rapidly tweaking things, and I can figure out the exact perfect shade of blue for something, or the exact perfect line length or something, perhaps based on rapidly using AI to tweak things, but really understanding in a complex way, how a person thinks isn't done by rapidly tweaking a bunch of different user experiences and seeing how people convert and click and retain and all that differently. It's done by talking to people, and that's the thing that you need humans for. So this is a space I think that's good to be in. There may be a day when AI can like do the user research for us and stuff, when it's that level of things, and there's some amount of stuff that you can supplement with that kind of stuff. I'm not saying there's no role for AI and machine learning, but the way that it impacts our work right now is not huge. It is basically, I would suggest, the big data, thick data thing. It's a way to kind of leverage the big data for a lot of fine tuning stuff, which is fine. But again, bottom line, I think that's the real work that we do involves a bunch of big cognitive tasks that are very human to do at heart. That may change, decades away or something, or even shorter term, but at least for the immediate term, I think that's not going to kill our work. Although some companies are trying, I think they're not there yet. Okay, next up. Question about application UX versus enterprise UX, and I assume that means like enterprise applications. I'm not totally sure if I understand. I'm not really sure I understand that question. Let me get to some of the other two questions. Maybe Craig, if you don't mind. Oh, wait, it wasn't. Yeah, Craig, if you don't mind, just put in the chat box if you're okay with being pulled in, because I'll need you to say a few words about that. I'll need to pull you into the room to speak to that. Let's see, tools for user search, user flow, and user map. Applications. Oh, so Craig says that he's talking about UX across multiple applications. Yeah. But I think it's better if he says a few words. I think I need to set a number of additional, let's see, I can allow to talk. Cool. I'm going to say 3 more questions I'll answer at this point. That'll be kind of considered the main ones. Maybe I'll stick around for 1 or 2 more, but I think I'm going to say 3 more that I'll actually do for sure. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Noah.
Say a few words what you're talking about. Help me out.
Okay, so I can see my question having relevance in 2 areas. Specifically, in my environment, we have a lot of custom development to support business processes within our organization. We also use some off-the-shelf products, but instead of looking at things application by application, we're really starting to think about how these applications work together as a suite. The second situation where I think it might be relevant is for somebody who's developing a bunch of different software products or modules that have to work together, kind of like what Microsoft does with its Office suite.
Right. Yeah, totally. So I would refer back to what I was saying about omnichannel strategy, right? So I need to have that kind of bird's eye, or maybe 10,000 foot view, 100,000. I need to have this view to that larger suite of things and really think about it from that level, and not just think about it, but do research to drive that thinking, right? In order to create that and think about how they fit together. And then I can go through, and by the way, you might you're talking about, I already have a bunch of things that are in place. I can do that, and then I can look at how all those different things fit together to achieve that. But I kind of need a strategy for what I want to have for all those things to fit together to drive all of that. That's the bottom line thing. I also want to take a moment just to say that the off-the-shelf software thing you're talking about, just to note, it's a thing we see a certain amount. It's a very normal constraint, and it constrains the work. It constrains the impact we have from a UX point of view, because there's often very limited stuff I can do to configure those different things that we get off the shelf. And long story short, it constrains the work we can do in UX. One of the more valuable things we can do in that case is help to select which things we get off the shelf, but that's a normal constraint. It's a normal challenge. Does that answer the question? Further questions on that, Greg?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay.
We really are. I think one thing that starting to move into this like enterprise UX space has led us to is we're looking well beyond usability and design issues that we really focused on when we were looking at individual UIs. And
Yeah,
I don't know. I think about this a lot, and I was just interested in hearing what you had to say. So thank you.
awesome. Happy to help. Yeah, that's very much why we're targeting that thing of the omnichannel strategy in that way. That's what that's for. Cool. Okay. Great. I think I didn't break that. Good. Let's see. Let's get the next one. Okay, so this was this question I started looking at a moment ago, right? Tools for user search, user flow, and user map. Um, I user search, user flow. In a way, I'm not totally sure what you're talking about. That Asker Roshanag, is it all right? Can you put in chat box? Is it okay for me to bring you into the room? Finding you now. Or just allow to talk. I'm clicking allow to talk. It's up to you if you do or not, but maybe you want to say a few words about what you mean by that. You'll have to go off mute, by the way. You'll have to click to go off mute. Just take another moment to see. He might have stepped away too. I feel bad for that. I'm not totally sure what he means by that. So, I mean, there are tools for kind of diagramming things out and all of that. I think that might be what he's talking about. I don't have a lot to say about those tools. Let's try different one. So, interested in the insights you may have about the application of UX versus, that's what we talked about. Sorry, I answered that. Okay. I think I have two more or something. AI, oh, we talked about that. Sorry. No, I'm not checking these off. Share the presentation we used. So sharing the presentation that we used, we're going to be putting the video up. And so we weren't planning on putting the slides up is the current plan. We're not currently planning on doing that. If you read, I hope I don't get a giant deluge, but so my email is just noah@human factors. If you want to send me a thing, just let me know, just so I know why you want to use that. I'm guessing you're just wanting to show something internally, which is no big deal, but just let me know what's going on. Let's see, and maybe the last one. I have skills in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, Photoshop, and illustration. What else do you suggest I should add to my skill set to be a UX professional? I mean, it's not about tools, right? So tools are fine, and those are reasonable tools. There are a variety of prototyping tools, but what prototyping tools are rapidly evolving, right? So, I mean, if you're just talking about tools, I see, Sketch, which fits in with the Envision suite, is pretty popular. It's very easy to learn and use. I see, I'm blanking on some of the other ones. I mean, there's a whole variety of these kind of prototyping tools. So there's stuff like that you could get up to speed on. I mean, the thing you're describing makes it sound like you want to be pretty specialized in the design area, but I would suggest that I would think more about getting up to speed on understanding a bunch of the research and psychology stuff. Now, you didn't say you don't have that background, so maybe whoever this anonymous attendee has that background. But and if you do, then you could disregard this. But I'm very leery about saying, oh, great, yeah, learn this or that tool. This is a psychology field, and if you don't have that background, then you can support people doing the work, but that's a different thing. If you want to call yourself a UX professional, right? But yeah, so I mean, some of those various kinds of tools. Axure is the other one I was trying to think of. Axure is another pretty popular prototyping tool. But bottom line, the prototyping tool you use is usually dictated by the company you're working at, and you just use whatever tool they're using. I mean, there are values in using different ones, but I don't think it's that important that you're using one or another prototyping tool. The other stuff you're talking about there is fine, but I mean, even things like HTML and CSS, that's more UI development stuff, right? That's not UX, it's a different thing. I'll do one more officially at least. Oh, wow. Okay, I love this question. So how do you convince technical experts to believe in the UX process, and how does agile methodology help UX researchers to provide a good solution? This is a big, messy thing. Bottom line, you want to have a plan for your UX methodology, and it should be detailed. That plan means that then you can draw out what you're actually doing. It doesn't feel like a bunch of fluffy, your opinion, my opinion, making some guesses and throwing some stuff together stuff. I'm actually following a plan of often starting with stakeholder interviews and understanding what stakeholders know to get me started. And then I'm doing a bunch of user research to improve my understanding, and then doing a bunch of design work, and then taking that design, iterating it, because I've just done it kind of a rough draft thing, and then bringing that to users and seeing how they would use it, and refining and improving on it, right? That kind of a process. And having that documented in a pretty detailed way will help to make it a lot clearer what you're doing, and that tends to help to get more credibility for what we're doing, more kind of believing in things. In general, bottom line, the more that you build the, oh, I just remembered, I promised I'd show some links. I'll put them in the chat box too. In general, as you find it, as you build more UX maturity, in general, you're going to get better kind of buy-in for UX, and the UX kind of culture of UX is better supported the more that you do that. So I'm showing this partially for the recording. And I know it's annoying to have you type in these letters and stuff, but it's just the easiest way I could put this. Maybe we can put this in the description or something too. So maybe check the description if you're looking for this, but I'll also put it in the chat. If you're looking on YouTube, it won't be in the chat, but that is there. Oops. Okay. Is that chat? Thanks for your patience. So that includes, that list, by the way, includes a couple other videos that I've done that are on some of the subjects that have come up and things like that too. I'm sorry that I haven't been paying much attention to chat. I know my colleague was earlier, but I'm doing it based on the upvotes thing. I will check out the chat later. I see many people saying thank you, and so thank you for attending. It's lovely to get to share with folks. All right, cool. So yeah, the UX process stuff, that's methodologies. I think I've answered that. Oh, the question about agile methodology, part of that. One of the links that I just provided, and part of why that reminded me, there's a webinar I did on agile specifically. So that's an hour long, roughly an hour plus a little Q&A kind of thing, where I talk about agile and speak to that. So that will speak to that more. And that didn't have a tremendous number of attendees, so it's kind of like a nice little secret of UX. But it is on our YouTube channel, so not too secret. Okay, cool. Lots of other good questions, and I wish I could answer them all. I'm so sorry if I've neglected anyone. If any of your questions are burning, then and things that you feel like would be better answered by me directly than that email I gave before, Noah at Human Factors, you can reach out there. I know sometimes it's not for that purpose. It's more so that we can all kind of share together. So apologies if I've left anyone out, but thank you all so much for coming. Let's consider this at the hour-and-a-half mark, and thank you for your patience. That's a long time to sit. We'll consider that at the end of this here. Yeah, I'm browsing through these already. I've answered a lot of these already. Great. Okay, thanks so much, guys.